So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Tonight I will talk about Adam Smith, and in particular, I will try to show you why Adam Smith can still be relevant today. The title is From Dull to Cheerful, and I will explain why that is the case in a second. But you could ask me, why do we care about this Adam Smith guy who was born over 300 years ago? As a matter of fact, next year, we are going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. And The Wealth of Nations is a long, at times, extremely boring book. So why should we care about it today? The problems are very different that we face today. The contexts are very different, so why bother? And I'm going to try to convince you that it's worth reading because there's still something to learn about it. So the title, From Dull to Cheerful. This is how Smith describes different kinds of economies. There is an economy that is stagnant, that doesn't grow, can be rich, but not growing, and is dull. Right? I mean, if you're stagnant, you're dull. An economy that grows, on the other hand, is cheerful. That's how he defines it. And on the other hand, a declining economy, an economy that shrinks, is melancholic. Again, you can intuitively understand why he uses these terms, but it's quite interesting that he thinks in terms of happiness, right? So he relates economic growth with happiness, with cheerfulness, and economic decline with sadness, melancholy. What are the lessons that I think can be relevant for today? And I'm going to tell you from the beginning, so there's no surprise. This is a killer, like the murderer here. There are at least 4 reasons why I think Smith can help us today for understanding how to move from stagnation to growth. A lot of economies today are okay, they are rich, but they're stagnant. So if we want to increase growth, what do we do? These are the lessons that Smith can tell us. First is that division of labor is limited by the size of the market. And again, I will explain all of them as we go through. The second is that the fair remuneration of labor and mobility of labor increases productivity. The third is that powerful interest groups, they are able to capture state power, are disruptive. And luck matters. I mean, it's something that not all economies take for granted, that luck actually plays a role. So let me ask you a question. What are the most important events recorded in human history? What do you think?
Development of farming.
Farming. Okay? What do you think is one of the most important developments in human history?
Industrial Revolution.
Industrial Revolution. Yes. Learning how to write. Yes.
Invention of the internal combustion.
Internal combustion engine was invented right when Smith was alive. Yes. So he was aware of it. And now that's too far away. Like we're like, I mean, it's correct, but like it's like move back a little bit before computers. So what could be the greatest events recorded in human history? Any other options? Yes. The printing press. Property rights. Fire? Yes, that's a good one. Second? Germ theory of disease, that was on the edge at the time, but yes, that could have been something that could have foreseen at least, yes. What else?
I guess the question that you're asking is, you have to frame it depending on how you see the situation.
No.
I mean,
I'm just asking, what are the two?
What your argument for race invention is increasing the gross productivity of mankind, or what?
That's how Smith asks the question. Right? Or he didn't ask the question, he answered that question. And I'm going to give you the answer. Because all your answers are great. And I agree with all of them. But those are not Smith's answers. These are Smith's answers. The discovery of America and the passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in human history. Huh? Would you have guessed it?
So basically, you want to increase the full size of the market.
That's exactly what he's saying.
But what is like we cannot expand to move.
This is Smith's answer, though. At this time, for him, the naval passages to India and America were the two most important events in human history. Right? It's not like, in the last 2 years or in the last 200 years. No, in human history. It's huge what he's saying. Right? So let's try to understand why he's convinced that the two most important events in human history are the discovery of America and the passage to the East India through the ocean. If I have to ask you, what do you know about Adam Smith? What is the most famous thing about Adam Smith? Invisible hand. Option number 2. Division of labor, exactly. Division of labor is important. Right? So why isn't the division of labor one of the most important events in human history? Pin factory, that's the way in which Smith describes division of labor. And it does tell us division of labor is super important. It is the greatest improvement in the productive power of labor. So if you want to grow rich, if you want to increase productivity, you need to have division of labor. Makes sense. We are able to consume a lot because we don't produce what we consume. And that is what we usually think makes us rich: increase in productivity, division of labor, specialization. That shouldn't be a big news, because if we try to make things ourselves, we are not very successful. Right? So here's an example of a toaster that was made from scratch by somebody. So somebody tries to make a toaster from scratch. You can find the whole thing on YouTube. So he started from scratch. He went and dig out the raw materials and learn how to do it, and that's the result. You can try to follow step by step, see if your result is any better. My doubt is that it's not going to be any better. So we know from experience and trying to make things ourselves is still silly. We are much better off specializing in doing something and then go buy other things. Right? But the problem with specialization is that we do only one thing. And so our pin factory that is so famous in the Wealth of Nations is great. But if you only make pins, and that's the end of the story, you will eat pins, because that's how you spend your day. You spend your day making pins and nothing else. So you have nothing else to eat but pins. So specialization by itself is very dangerous, because you do only one thing, and that's the end of it. You can't consume only one thing. In order to specialize, or when you specialize, you need to do something else. Smith says, think of a pin factory in the Highlands of Scotland in Smith's time. Already, if you go now in the Highlands of Scotland, there's not much there. Right? But in Smith's time, there was even less. So imagine somebody in the Highlands of Scotland making pins. Great. I specialize in making pins. And what do I do with all the pins? Yeah, to whom? There's nobody there. Right? Maybe I find somebody, would you like some pins? And you say, okay, maybe I buy 3. Hey, excellent. And then what do I do with the money that he gives me? I have nothing to buy because there's nobody there. So Smith tells us that in the Highlands of Scotland, where there's nobody around, and you're very isolated, you're going to be poor, because you will not be able to specialize. Your productivity will be low. You will have to be a pin maker, a butcher, a baker, a brewer, a shoemaker. You have to do everything yourself. And if you try to do everything yourself, not very productive, therefore poor. So specialization works only if you can trade. That's a key point Smith is making. Specialization works only if you have access to markets. Otherwise, you will eat your pins. Smith tells us, first you trade, then you specialize. Specialization follows from trading. But if you can't trade, it makes no sense to specialize. So you need to have access to market in order to divide labor. If you don't have access to market, if you cannot trade, don't specialize, because you will starve. Division of labor is not the result of any human wisdom, but the necessary, though very slow, gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature to track, barter, and exchange. So we first start with trade, and then we specialize. Again, if you cannot trade, it makes no sense whatsoever to do only one thing and specialize, because you will not be able to consume. So access to market is key, is the fundamental starting point for division of labor, for increasing productivity. But without access to market, you can't divide labor, you can't increase productivity, you will remain poor. And this is why Smith is saying that the naval routes to America and India are the two greatest events in humankind, because they open new markets. And that is what allows for further division of labor, further specialization, increase in productivity, and economic growth. And it's not an accident that there are naval routes, because water is the cheapest way to transport things. This is a huge long quote, pardon me. I'm gonna just condense it. I just wanna tell you that he actually goes through all the details in explaining why water is actually most important. And he says, look at history of civilization. Where do we see the greatest, earliest civilization? Near water. Sea or navigable rivers, right? So it tells us that the Mediterranean coast had first civilizations. Why on the coast, not inside? Because the coast allowed for trade. And if you allow for trade, you allow for specialization, you allow to increase productivity, you allow for economic growth. So Mediterranean coasts, Egypt, because the Nile is navigable. And Bengal, East Indian, and Eastern province of China. Why? Again, navigable canals or navigable rivers. So Smith doesn't focus just on Europe, he just looks at the whole history of the world that he knows, and he says, where do you see civilization? They're growing, they're powerful, near water. And it's not an accident because water allows for trade. And he gives us this example. Imagine to transport goods from Calcutta to London by land. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be very expensive. So you're going to have very limited trade. On the other hand, if you go by boat, you can carry more things and faster. So he gives this example of transporting 2,000 tons of weight from Edinburgh to London in 6 weeks. And this is striking the difference in cost. By water, you need 6 to 8 men. By road, you need 50 broad wheel wagons, 100 men, and 400 horses. Huge difference. So whenever you can transport things by water, you are able to expand your markets much more easily. And this is, again, why the two routes by water to America and India are the two major events in human history. Is this okay so far? Yep. Smith goes even farther. Says, if you allow for trade, you don't need anything. You don't need natural resources. You don't need to have mines. You don't need to have land, fertile land. You can just buy stuff. And he says, well, look, Asia, great empire. China is the richest, in his time, he said that China is the richest country in the world. No mines. Says, look at Peru, mines, not that rich. So having natural resources is not what makes you rich. Having navigable river is what makes you rich, because you're able to trade. Access to market is what allows you to be rich. Europe says, well, look at the emergence of cities in Europe. In cities, you cannot grow anything, but you can trade and buy food from the countryside. And that's how Europe grew to prosperity, through the development of cities. Again, no land to cultivate in cities, but access to market. And the cities were all near rivers or water. So access to market, open market, is what makes a difference. If you close your economy, you are forcing yourself into poverty or into lack of growth. If you close your economy, you are forcing yourself into stagnation. The path to growth for Smith is open economies, open markets. He gives the example of China. As I said, for Smith, China is the richest country in the world. But Smith says China hasn't grown from the time of Marco Polo. It's stagnant, it's dull. China is the example of a dull economy for Smith. From the time of Marco Polo to 1776, no growth. Why? Because China is a closed economy. They refuse foreign trade. They're rich, but they're not growing. They're rich because of the internal market. It's a very large country. Again, and you're connected with your rivers. So you can grow rich, but then you can't grow anymore. And Smith says, if China opened up to international trade, China would grow. But it doesn't, and so remains dull. This is not an example that he gives, but I'm giving it to you anyway, because Smith experienced it. So Smith was a Scottish person. He lived in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, but he was born he worked in Glasgow at least. And Glasgow and Scotland in general, before 1700, was a very poor country. Glasgow was a very poor city. And then in 1706, Scotland unified with England. So it was a union of crowns. So now Scotland is part of Britain, which means that is part of the empire. And it just happened that Glasgow is a very convenient port to get to the North American colonies. It's the best route to get to and from the North American colonies. So before 1706, Glasgow was very poor, Scotland was very poor. After the union with England, something happened. A big boom, a big economic boom. The population of Glasgow went from 13,000 to 77,000 in less than a century. That's a huge increase if you think about, especially at the time. How is that possible? Because access to market. Glasgow is now the main port that deals with North American colonies. Access to market is what allows you to grow. North American colonies, they are an example of a cheerful economy. This is the example that Smith does give us, because their population doubles every 25 years. Population in Britain doubles every 500 years. That gives you a sense of the difference. Why is that the case? Because the economy is growing. Why is it growing? Because you have a whole European market available to you. Granted, there are questions about what, but still the goods come to Europe. So access to market is what allows you to grow. Closed economy, you're choking. Second lesson that we can get from Smith is that if you pay your workers well, they will work well. If you pay them poorly, they will work poorly. So where wages are high, we shall find workmen more active, more diligent, expeditious than when they are low. Are there any business owner here? Yes. Do you have employees? Yes. Do you work more or less than your employees? Much more. That's exactly what Smith is saying. It's your business. You get the fruits of your labor. I'm using fruits of your labor is the expression that Smith uses. And so you have all the right incentive to work much more than your employees. So an independent worker or a business owner, like the gentleman here, will work very hard because he will keep the fruits of his labor. An employee, on the other hand, may work hard, but not as hard because he has to share the fruit of his labor with the business owner. And so, why go to work on time all the time? Sometimes I may be late, and that's okay. Because the results are shared with the business owner. The employer who's paid a fixed salary as incentive to work even less. Like if you work on commission, you work a little bit more than if you work on a fixed salary, Smith says. Because if you work on commission, if you work by piece, the more you work, the more you earn. If you instead you pay the fixed salary, it doesn't matter how much you work, you still get the same amount. And so you're less productive. And then Smith says, the least productive at all of labor, enslaved labor. They have no incentive to work. The only reason why they work is because they don't work. If they don't work, they're killed. But don't expect somebody who's enslaved to work very hard as a gentleman in the back. Because he owns his business, he keeps the fruits of his labor, the enslaved person doesn't. So he has no incentive to work. So Smith is saying if you pay your workers liberally, if you pay them well, they will have a more incentive to work, and to work well, they will be more productive. If you treat them with dignity, they will be more productive than if you treat them badly. Smith is working in a context in which there is this idea that if you are poor, it's your fault because you're lazy. That's the context in which Smith is working. And Smith is saying, you know what? It's not necessarily the case that you are poor because you're lazy. It may be the case that the people who are lazy because they don't have the right incentive to work. If you actually pay them correctly, they will work. As a matter of fact, if you pay them a lot, they will overwork. They will exhaust themselves. They will not be able to work 6 days a week because they work so hard the first 4 days that the last day you're like, they can't go to work, just not because they're lazy, but because they don't have any energy anymore. So Smith is criticizing the policies at the time where wages are kept artificially low. At the time, there were maximum wage laws. There were laws that kept wages to a maximum. You couldn't increase wages. But in order to be able to pay fair wages or liberal wages to your workers, the workers have to be able to move. So labor mobility is key to productivity because you have to allow labor to go where they're paid the most, and you have to allow employers to attract the workers that they want. He gives the example of the North American colony, which again is a cheerful economy, where there's such an economic growth that businesses have to compete for workers. So wages are very high. And the economy is booming. This implies that if you have open markets, you're able to increase productivity through division of labor and through specialization. If you have open markets and competition, you're able to have forces that allows you to pay your workers well and workers to move. This implies that you're able to grow more because productivity increases. And if productivity increases, you are able to divide your labor more, to be even more specialized, to pay your worker even better. And this starts a virtuous spiral, what in economics we call increasing returns. So Smith is one of the first people who thinks that there are increasing returns in the economy if the incentives are correct, if you have open economies, and if you are able to pay your workers liberally. And that is what makes an economy cheerful. There is a dark side. This is a good side, but then there is a dark side too. Because an economy can be dull, can be cheerful, but can also be melancholic, can contract, can shrink. So how is it possible for an economy to shrink? Smith gives an example of Bengal. Bengal is a very fertile land, as Smith says, and yet 300,000 or 400,000 of people die of hunger in a very fertile land a year. How is it possible? Because Bengal is governed by the East Indian Company, which is a monopoly. And it's a monopoly because merchants are able to obtain privileges. So they are able to be a monopoly. Smith says merchant and manufacturers tend to be in cities. So they're very close to each other as opposed to in the countryside where people are far away. They're few and concentrated. People in the countryside are far away, dispersed, many of them. It's harder to cartelize. It's harder to get together if you are spread far away from a lot of you. It's much easier if you live close by and there are few of you. So Smith says merchant and manufacturer are able to concentrate, share the same benefits, the same ideas, as opposed to the multitude of people that are dispersed. So the costs are dispersed. And he said, well, what's the problem with merchants and manufacturers? If you're a merchant, do you want competition? Do you want another merchant doing exactly the same thing right next to you? Yeah, you know, like, yeah, I like competition in theory, but not in my business, right? So please go do something else. So you don't want to have competition. You do want to sell at the highest price that you can. So you want high prices, and to keep those prices high, you want to limit your competitors. It's like, okay, well, that's what you want. And if that's the case, in a sense, that's fine, right? It's not a big deal. The problem for Smith is that those merchants are able to convince you that what is good for them is what's good for everybody. And so the tobacco dealers can say, oh, what is good for my business is good for the country. So you should give me the ability to be the only importer of tobacco because it's much easier for the country to tax tobacco if it only comes through me. Right? So I make up a story that convinces you that what is good for my business is good for the country. And again, if that's the only part, it's sort of okay. The problem is that I'm not just convincing you, I'm also convincing the legislator. And that's a problem. Because if I just convince you, fine, you believe me and you say, oh, Maria is great. But if I convince the legislator that what is good for me is what is good for the country, then I will be able to impose laws that says only Maria's business is the one who's allowed to import tobacco. And it's good for the country, by the way, of course, right? Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. Yes?
What about, what are the laws of finance that money chases the best return possible?
You must, yeah, you must chase you want to chase the best return possible. Yes.
So to take an example, the iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Why would Steve Jobs have invested, we talk about incentives as economists.
Yeah.
Why why would Steve Jobs have an incentive to create the iPhone if somebody then could have gone to Japan or China and produced it much cheaper and brought it? He would have no return on his, he would have a very low return on his investment, which would make all investments in capital projects extremely high risk.
Right. So there are different circumstances. So, and Smith is aware of it. So Smith is willing to allow for certain kind of monopolies for patents. So patents are okay. Eventually the patents expire and somebody else will copy you, but at least you have enough time to earn what you spent in investment, right? But this monopoly, the East Indian Company, or the other monopolies that were present in Britain, were not monopoly on inventions. Right? We're like, I want to be the only trader in this route. I want to be the only trader of this good. I want you, government, to stop importing from this country. Let me produce it. Let me produce the textile. Don't buy French linen. Let me produce it my own, because mine is better than French. So it's not a question of invention or protecting invention or protecting innovation, is giving privileges to existing businesses. And that's a very different situation. It suppresses innovation in the sense that you prevent competition from entering, yes. Yes. Yes?
What about like price banner? Like for example, like if you assume that there's a perfectly free society, there's no like a regulation, but you might encounter cases where the total social revenues got diminished because everybody is selfish.
Because everybody is?
Selfish.
Selfish. So the first of all, let me just make a small adjustment to what you said. So you said that let's assume that a society has no regulations, right? Smith doesn't assume that. Regulations are needed. And he is very strongly promoting some regulation in some circumstances. The problem is, what is the source of that regulation? So if I am producing wool, and I am the one going to the government and say, you need to regulate the wool trade. Most likely, Smith says, that kind of regulation will benefit me at your expense. So that is a kind of regulation that Smith is condemning. But that doesn't mean that all regulation or all laws regulating trade are bad. It's just that you have to be very, very, very careful about who is the one promoting that law. So if a law comes from a special interest group in today's language, from a lobby, careful, because most likely benefits some at the expense of others. In theory, you should have a good legislator who is above everybody else and is able to see what is good for the country. Difficult, very difficult. And Smith is very skeptical about that possibility. So he says, before accepting a law, be super, 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 super careful. Because most likely there is a special interest group behind that is pushing it. And if that's the case, you benefit some at the expense of others. And Smith himself favors regulations, and he suggests several regulations in many circumstances. But the way in which he presents it is like, is society overall better off? Yes. Is somebody better off at the expense of others? No. Okay, so that works.
I mean, isn't the goal to make regulations that don't choose choose winners and losers, but creates a level playing field
Yeah.
for everyone and some level of safety.
That's exactly what Smith is saying. So this is why he's not condemning all regulations, but is condemning the one that come from special interest groups.
Right.
And they're different. It's difficult to distinguish, superficially at least, but as soon as you start digging, you're able to see where the money goes. Any other questions so far? Yes. Of a regulation that does not come from a special interest group. Yes. So Smith is favoring regulation in the banking system. So he favors a system of free banking, which means that you have competitive bank of issues. So you don't have a central bank. Each bank can print their own money. So in a sense, it's completely free compared to today. There's no monopoly of issuing. And yet, it says, you should forbid small denomination notes.
Small what?
Denomination notes, small banknotes. Why? Because it says, if you are, who's gonna get small denomination notes? Workers, like regular workers. Because there's not enough change, small coins to pay them, so it's convenient to have these notes. Has somebody ever given you a $100 bill? Yes? What do you do when you get a $100 bill? Say again?
You break it.
What do you mean you break it? Yeah. But yes, you break it. But when you try to break it, you bring it to a store, right? What does the store person at the front, the cashier, do? It checks for counterfeit. Do they check for counterfeit with a $1 bill? No. Why? But why don't you check if a $1 bill is counterfeit, but you do check if a $100 is counterfeit?
There's no return in producing $1 bills when the same work can produce a $100 bill.
Yes, so you expect to have more fake 100 than more fake ones. Yes.
Also, your ROI for spending time trying to check it for counterfeit. For $1, we're left with on your own.
That's exactly Smith's logic. It's like, you're not gonna be bothered checking whether a $1 bill is fake or not, but you do bother to check whether a $100 bill is fake or not, right? So with small denomination notes, it is more likely that you're gonna get problems. That the banker that issues small denomination notes will go bankrupt. You will make sure that the banker who issues a large denomination bill is a good one. But for small denomination notes, who cares? Just small denomination, small change. So Smith says the chance that a banker will go bankrupt with small denomination notes is high. The chance that the banker goes bankrupt if they issue large denomination notes, not high. But who gets small denomination notes? Who are workers. And if they get notes that are worthless because the bank goes bankrupt, what happens? They're doomed. They have no option. They will starve. It's a very bad thing. If a big merchant loses a couple of notes, yes, too bad, but they will survive. So Smith says small denomination notes should not be present. And that's, again, and he says, I know that this is controversial because both parties want them, but is an infringement on liberty that is worth doing. And he compares it to, call it party walls. The party walls were walls that partition properties. Again, think of Britain in the 1700s, houses made out of wood, heating made out of fire, lights made out of fire, chances of a fire that burns down your house, fairly high. If your house is next to another house, what's going to happen? You burn down the next house, and then the next, and then the next. Before you know, London is burning. You have firewall or party walls that are partitioning properties so that if I have fire in this place, the fire is blocked. It doesn't go over. As Smith says, those are violations of liberty because I don't want to have this wall. I want to have a nice view, but I can't. But those are necessary. So that's an example of a regulation that Smith favors that does not necessarily benefit a specific group at the expense of others. Yes?
So for smaller denominations, wouldn't at a certain point getting rid of them incur inflation? Because if you're not going to be able to pay someone in dollars and you're paying someone in cash, let's say minimum wage is above $5 an hour, so you're paying someone in increments of 10, and you're either going to have to pay them $10 an hour or $20 an hour. So wouldn't you incur some level of inflation in a certain part?
Yes and no. So the no part is because the bills that were issued by banks were large denomination notes. So we're something like the $20,000, not $20. Okay, so there are merchant notes. So those are separate markets. So you don't use the larger denomination notes to pay your workers because they're too large. It's like literally a $20,000 bill. So the solution would be to use credit or small coins, which is a problem because you don't have the small coins. So usually it's credit or other forms of currency that are made up. Right? So inflation is not necessarily something that would emerge from that situation. Okay, so far? So let's go back to our lobbying problem. You have special interest groups who are able to capture state power to benefit themselves, to achieve privileges. As Smith says, they are actually seeking blood money. That's not Smith's word, it's my word. Sorry, it's not that word. But I interpreted Smith saying that they enrich themselves with blood money. But what Smith is saying is that those special interest groups, by achieving their privileges, by able to monopolize their markets, will cause death. Will cause death directly and indirectly. Directly because to protect those monopolies, you are willing to go to war. As Smith says, the last few wars that the British Empire fought were fought to protect monopolies. As a matter of fact, Smith says, the entire British Empire is a product of special interest groups. The East Indian Company, that destruction of crops that they caused in Bengal, hundreds of thousands of people who die of starvation, is because of the East Indian Company. Those are actually caused by monopoly. If you have monopolies, you have high prices. And who suffers the most for high prices? The poor. And in Smith's time, the poor were poor. Meaning that the poor were so poor they were not able to support the life of their children. As Smith says, look, in the Highlands of Scotland, we already saw as a poor part of the country, a woman gives birth to 20 children and only 2 will survive to adulthood. And no wonder an economy that does not grow is dull or melancholic, right? Imagine that 18 of your children die is horrible. And they die because you can't afford to feed them, or because you're so malnourished that you're not able to to give enough nutrition to them. If you increase prices, you prolong poverty. If you increase prices, you're able, not because of, if you increase prices because of monopoly, because of state capture, you're actually blocking economic growth. You're prolonging poverty and you're causing death. Smith is quite aggressive in criticizing monopoly. He calls the wealth of nations a very violent attack against the mercantile system of Britain. Doesn't say anything good about merchants. To hurt in any degree the interest of any order of citizens for no other purpose than to promote that of some other is evidently contrary to justice and equality of treatment which a sovereign owes to all his subjects. Which goes back to the gentleman who was saying the laws should create a playing field for everybody and not privilege some at the expense of others. Luck matters too. So Smith tells us, yeah, you do everything right and still things go wrong, or you do everything wrong and things may go right. So yes, growth is great. We have some lesson on how to grow, but don't be too arrogant. Like, there are certain things that are out of your control. Discovery of America, one of the greatest events in humankind, was an accident. The fall of the feudal system, which is what causes the economic growth in Europe, was an accident. The invention of firearms was an accident. So there are a lot of accidents, according to Smith. So be humble. Be aware of the fact that there are factors that allows you to grow, but be humble. And so, to conclude, there are at least 4 lessons that I think we can learn from Adam Smith today. That access to market is what allows you to grow. Open markets are a key to economic growth. The liberal remuneration of workers, or allowing people to enjoy the fruits of their labor, as well as allowing them to move where they can get the fruits of their labor, is another factor of economic growth. Limiting special interest groups, limiting the power of lobbies, is allowing you to grow more, and luck as well. If you're able to have these, you can start a positive cycle of increasing return, and then you can grow from dull to cheerful. Thank you.
Great, I think we have some time for questions.
Yes.
Given your experience with the readings, in not just with Adam Smith, but with all the classics, because you're an economic historian, what do you think they would come out with if they were made aware of the blockchain?
Or currency.
So, I guess, can you be more specific in what use of blockchain?
You mentioned that Smith said, and it's happened in the U.S. where banks issue currency. There's been a lot of different variations globally, but in the variation put forth by some people who
Is
are
it-
pushing crypto,
Okay.
basically Bitcoin will rule,
Yeah.
commerce globally.
Yeah.
And how would if they were all getting a conference, how do you think they would put a position statement out on that?
Right. So as I said, Smith was in favor of free banking. So was in favor of competitive banking system in which each bank, anybody could open a bank, basically, and each bank could issue its own currency. Now, his logic was the following. In order for you to open a bank, you need to be trusted. So I need to trust that whatever you give me will be accepted by somebody else, and it will be redeemable for gold and silver. So the Bank of Issues were all issuing papers that were convertible to gold and silver. Now, how do I trust you? Your reputation and your asset. So the banks had unlimited liabilities. So if you issue something that was not redeemable anymore, you would actually have to sell your own land to pay me back. So even the largest bank or the largest disaster in banks in Smith's time was the Air Bank. None of the note holder actually lost anything. It was the largest redistribution of land in Scotland at the time, but none of the bank note holder lost anything that they had. So unlimited liability was a key for making the bank responsible for not overissuing. And convertibility. So the banknotes had to be convertible on demand. So another regulation that Smith favored was to avoid what at the time was called the option clause. And the option clause was the option not to redeem it today, but in 3 months. I'll pay you interest for those 3 months, but I'm not going to give you gold right now or silver right now. Smith said, bad idea. You need to convert paper into gold or silver immediately, because otherwise you're giving incentive to banks to overissue. So those are the things that Smith saw as stabilizers. Because with those kind of incentives, banks would learn pretty quickly not to overissue. That doesn't mean that they never overissued. They did. But Smith said, just because the system was new, they had to figure out how things worked. But now that they did, they learned fairly quickly that they should not overissue, even if there is a temptation to overissue because you earn more. So with crypto, for Smith, you would have to have something similar in place. You would have to be able to convert into gold or silver or the equivalent of, and you would have to have unlimited liability. And I'm not sure that that's the case today.
Yeah.
Sure.
I understand the unlimited liability. So I'm at a loss to identify where liability would be in a Bitcoin.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly what I'm saying. That I'm not sure that the system would be equivalent, because there is no, like, who's going to be liable? Right? Who are you going to go after? Yes.
Yeah, I guess the way I see the Bitcoin thing and the blockchain just means you have a public ledger. That's it.
Yeah.
Plain and simple. You can track who has what. But the problem you have with Bitcoin is it's anything but a currency. A currency that's got stable value. It has something. In theory, you should have something going behind it. We don't have that anymore. That's part of the problem. And without that, it's not going to become a currency. It's really just a greater tool. I've got it and I hold it because That's it.
Right.
And you really have to come to that conclusion. It's pure speculation.
Yeah. The gentleman in the back?
I think Smith is generally perceived among the general populace as standing for selfishness, standing for sort of material greed.
Standing for
selfishness.
Selfishness, yes. Yep.
See him as a shortcut
Yep.
to those sorts of ideas.
Yep.
You pointed out well tonight his ideas around how self-interest well understood can be conducive to the common good. I'd love to hear if you could share a bit about his views of the particular good for individuals. What is the good life for human beings? He wrote Moral Sentiments before Wealth of Nations and then revised it.
Right.
Afterward, he has this famous vignette of people chasing and hustling to try to earn a bunch of money, and then at the end they're totally unhappy with it, right? He seems to have a view that is higher than material good. What are those views for individuals?
Right. So the stereotype of Smith is that he is favoring greed and selfishness. So what is his view of good life?
What is the good life for an individual?
Yeah.
A society that allows them to be greedy.
Yeah. So the stereotype is a stereotype, and there is nothing in Smith that actually would support that stereotype. So it is a bad caricature. If you actually search Wealth of Nations for self-interest, you will not find it. As a matter of fact, there is one use of the word self-interest, and is clergymen. But even the brewer, the baker, and the butcher, that is not for their benevolence that you get your dinner, but is for their own interest, not self-interest, and it's different. So you appeal to their own interest, not to their own self-interest. Greed is highly condemned. Sorry, try to get there. Here. That's greed. The ability to, so you are so greedy that you're willing to step over people's head to get ahead. You are condemned. There is nowhere in the Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments that Smith would say, good, go for it. No. Merchants and manufacturers, you actually cannot find a good word about merchants in the Wealth of Nations. So Smith is not favoring businesses. Smith is favoring competition, because that's what keeps businesses in check. But businesses by themselves, they are the ones seeking privileges. So you don't want to give privileges to business, you want competition so that you're actually kept in check. So I wouldn't say that Smith favors greed, self-interest, because that's not true. What's a good life? The good life, Smith said that what we want is to better our condition. And we can better our condition in many ways. By being virtuous and by accumulating wealth. We want to be loved, we want to be appreciated by others, and wealth helps. Right? I mean, I'm gonna use this, it doesn't use these words, but it uses something very similar. Homeless is looked down at or is ignored. You don't want to see a homeless. So you pass by a homeless and you're just like, yeah, pretend you're not there. A super wealthy person, like a rock star or a big athlete, oh, look, you take pictures, right? But you don't take picture of the homeless. So wealth is something that allows you to be seen, and that's something that you want. Poverty is something that you want to hide. So this natural desire to better our condition implies our desire to accumulate wealth so that we can be appreciated by others. But Smith says, careful, how you do it. Being virtuous is also something good, something that you want. So you don't want just to be loved, you want to be lovely as well. The problem is that sometimes it's easier to recognize wealth than to recognize virtue. Right? You have no idea whether I'm a good person or not. I can go home and beat my children. You would never know. But you can guess more or less that I'm not an indigent person because of how I look, right? So it's easier to recognize wealth than to recognize virtue. So sometimes we are tempted by big gains. If I can gain a lot now, I can jump my status, can become very rich. If I'm very rich, you will forget somehow how I got that money. So if you have a big jump in wealth, that can actually trump virtue. But you have to be very careful. Most people, though, are able to balance virtue and wealth. And so wealth accumulated in time, slowly, is what Smith thinks is, in a good way, in an honest way, is what allows you to fulfill your desire to better your condition. And that's the majority of people. Then you have the extreme cases like the merchants that they try to make that jump. And that's not necessarily a good thing. But most of us, in a combination of working honestly so that we can enjoy the fruits of our labor, that's how we will get a good life. Yes?
Wouldn't greed be necessary for growth?
No.
Why? Because, I understand what it says there, but if you think about it, for example, Apple utilizes greed, and so does Nike and most larger corporations to grow at a rapid pace. Mm-hmm. We outsource to China or other countries building products cheaper in order for us to grow at a more rapid pace. I imagine if it was made in the US, the company would have to pay their employees larger wages, which would decrease how fast they would grow, because their initial expenses are much higher, I would imagine.
Right. So there is a difference between interest and greed, right? So it makes no sense to ask you to work for free, right? We don't get our dinner from the benevolence of the butcher, right? So if you want to obtain something, you have to appeal to the interest of the other person. So you need to pay somebody to work for you. And I can pay you or I can pay somebody in China. If I can pay somebody in China and produce more, why not? That's not greed. That's just like a normal business practice. Greed is I am going to step over you to achieve what I want. Greed is I am going to ask for privileges, so I'm going to use the government force. I don't have that force. The government does. So I'm going to use the government force to push you off. That's greed.
Maybe I'm missing something, but I'm just using those two large corporations as an example. But I'm sure Nike pays they pay a business over there a certain amount. That business then pays their employees maybe $1.50, $4, $5. The amount is. But Nike knows that they're paying them way less, and that's why they're utilizing it, which would then say they know their stuff.
Right.
On purpose, like human rights violations to us, whether it's
yeah, that's exactly it. So if Nike was really such an evil corporation that destroys the life of people in China, would Chinese work for them? Why are people working for Nike? Because? is better than alternative. Right? I think it is very desperation, absolutely desperation. But can I, sorry, hold on. Can I? No, I cannot.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna give you a gender specific situation. What's the alternative for girls? What is the alternative for girls?
What do you mean what's the alternative? In China?
So you can either work for Nike or say again? Prostitution. Right. So you have to be careful when you say, well, no, Nike should pay them more. Great, let them pay them more, and then they will hire less. And then what happens to the people that they don't hire? So for girls, it's very easy to tell you what happens. Prostitution. So careful.
So I guess
It's easier for girls.
What they do. I just think that greed, now that you've made it more clear, it's not greed, it's interest.
Right.
That helps drive. So I should have worded that.
But again, is Nike telling the US government or the Chinese government no other shoe factory should be present in the market? That's the difference that Smith makes. Huh?
You want to build a plant here, but you got to suppress American wages to $10 an hour. And presumably, American workers make more money than
One more, yes, the gentleman.
How was the Adam Smith book received at the time by the economic and political powers?
It was a great success. It was eagerly waited for. It was published March 1776. It was eagerly waited for because, I mentioned before, he believed that the entire British Empire was a product of a special interest group of merchants and manufacturers. And that means that the colonies were a very perverse aspect of Britain. So he actually says, let the colony go. Get rid of the colonies. So the entire book is revolving about the monopolies that merchants had over the colonies, East and in America. And Smith is saying, get rid of the colonies because they are a cost to them, to Britain, and that are the reason why we have all these monopolies. If you don't get rid of them, incorporate them. Make all British citizens. Make a union with the colonies. Just like there was a union between England and Scotland, make a union between North American colonies and Indian colonies.
So my question I had in mind more, how was it received in England or continental Europe?
It was,
in the US?
no, this was in Europe. In Europe was very much, people were eagerly waiting for it, and they praised the book to no end because of the description of the situation of the British Empire. Yeah, it was a great success. It sold out immediately.
I would have thought that because England was a special interest empire, there would be enough controversy and
Nope, it was a super incredible success. So it sold out immediately. The second edition had to be published on the spot. It was it was translated in German on the same year. It was like poof, poof, poof. It was really like super welcomed and all positive.
That's great. So please join me in thanking Professor Pia Paganelli.